Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is where you are. You're welcome to the 29th Annual IAFFE Conference and the first IAFFE virtual conference and only our second bilingual conference. We're very happy to see you here. Whether this is your first time coming to an IAFFE meeting or you have attended every one or somewhere in between, you are welcome. Whether you are still not sure whether you're a feminist economist and you're here to try to figure out what it's all about, or whether you're someone for whom being a feminist economist is at the core of your intellectual identity, you are welcome. Whether you were trained as a mainstream economist, a feminist economist, if you were really lucky, or your background is in another discipline, anthropology, politics, communication, public policy, geography, gender studies, or anything else, you are most welcome. And whether you're most comfortable speaking English, Spanish, or something else, you are welcome. As you will see, we have many of the sessions, all of the plenary sessions and many of the other sessions will have interpretation. And you can see on the bottom of this first slide how to access it. As you know, this year's theme is Sustaining Life, Challenges of Multidimensional Crises. Actually, that was last year's theme. But after we had to cancel last year due to COVID-19, the theme still seemed relevant, perhaps more so. As we began planning over a year and a half ago, the crises were about the divisions we face along the lines of race, religion, nationality, gender, and sexual identity, among others. We were worried about the environment, climate change, war and conflict, refugees, migration, the rise of increasingly authoritarian regimes, as well as threats to our jobs, livelihoods, and bodily integrity. None of those have gone away. We've added new layers of crises with the global pandemic, which has created new challenges and also made many of the inequalities in our world even more visible. It has brought our work as feminist economists on care and unpaid work into the arena of public discussions in a way that it never had been before. The murder of George Floyd in the US and the Black Lives Matter movement put issues of racial injustices back on the front pages. And at my university in Oxford, issues of racism and colonialism have been in the headlines again these past weeks over the question of whether the statue of Cecil Rhodes, a symbol of British colonialism in Southern Africa, should be taken down. And these are just the three issues most immediate in my life. We will hear from many of you this week about both the most immediate issues that you are facing, as well as the deeper underlying challenges that we're all facing. And all of these raise again and again the need for our feminist intersectional analyses. And so here we are. We are here to talk about what's going on in our world. As feminist economists, how do we document what's happening, ensuring that all voices are heard and represented, and that everyone's story is told? How do we take what is happening and use it to develop better theories and better empirical approaches? How do we work to change it and move towards a more feminist agenda? That's why we're here, to share our research, our stories, and our hopes for what can be, to share our tools, our methods, our insights, and our visions. And we're not just about understanding the challenges, but also about sustaining life. I want to add one more note. Yesterday, we had a wonderful pre-conference with the young scholars. It was great to hear the energy and the vision. And I want to tell all of you young scholars that you are needed and welcome, both as feminist economists and as members of IAFFE. There is much work to be done, and we need your new and different skills, your perspectives, and your insights as we work together. I am really looking forward to our 4 days together. At this point, I'd like to introduce Carmen Diana Deere to provide a welcome from our hosts.
Thank you, Cheryl. Good day, everyone. On behalf of the Quito Local Arrangements Committee, I am delighted to welcome you to the 2021 IAFFE Congress. We had hoped, of course, to be welcoming you to Quito in person last June. The conference was to be held at the campus of Flaxo, the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences. And we owe a great debt to the staff and faculty at Flaxo for their tremendous effort to host a successful conference, which alas had to be canceled. We have had a heroic local committee planning the conference. Actually, I should say planning 2 conferences since July 2018, the canceled one, and of course this week's virtual conference. Our local committee has consisted of 20 scholars from the 4 main universities in Quito, plus individuals from 7 other institutions. I want to specifically acknowledge the universities that co-hosted some of the pre-conference events: the Pontifical Catholic University of Ecuador, the Andean University Simón Bolívar, and the Central University of Ecuador. We're delighted to see that some of our efforts and those of Cheryl Doss and the IAFFE Planning Committee come to fruition in this virtual conference, and hope you enjoy IAFFE 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen Diana. And I just wanted, Jihi, you want to put the slides back up? I just wanted to quickly recognize, not read all the names, but thank again the people who were involved in the Quito Local Arrangements Committee. It's such a shame that all the work that they did to get ready for us last year to actually be in Quito. I was listening in on all of the conversations and hearing what was happening, and it was going to be wonderful. They'd done all of that work to host us physically there, and then have been just wonderful working with us as we've regrouped and done a virtual conference. I also want to thank the members of the IAFFE Program Committee. So Jihi, if you go to the next slide, we've had a wonderful group of people involved in thinking about the program. These are just the formal committee, but we had lots of other people, and also the people who read all the abstracts and tried to figure out which papers we should actually include on the program. We had more papers than we could actually put on the program this year. So we had to make some hard choices, but we're glad to see you all here. With that, let me turn to our panel discussion. So the panel discussion today is on this year's theme. Let me first say a word or two about the format. We have 3 speakers. I'm going to invite them each to speak. And then following all 3 presentations, we're going to have time for questions and discussion. The 3 topics are all overlapping and interrelated enough that I think the discussion is much better if we hold it all to the end. What I'd like to ask you to do is to put your questions in the chat as we go along. We're going to collate them, and Jihi's going to feed them to me, and I will try to ask the questions, put them together in whatever way we need to do. If you're bilingual, I would ask you to put the questions in English. That's a little easier for us. If you only speak Spanish, that's fine. Put the questions in the chat in Spanish, and we'll get them translated, because we do want to hear everybody's questions. So I've already raised the issues of multidimensional crises. And so next we're going to hear 3 perspectives on some of the crises, on how the crises have affected us, but also on how to move forward. What do we need to be thinking about to move forward? All 3 of our speakers are IAFFE board members. All 3 current IAFFE board members, all 3 have careers that have spanned both academia and some combination of policy, activism, and advocacy. They've all written and published extensively, and I would encourage you to look them up. Their biographies are on the IAFFE board members webpage, and I'm not going to go through them all in detail. But let me introduce them to you briefly. First, we will have Jayati Ghosh, who taught economics at Jawahar. I practiced this.
Just say Nehru. Just Nehru is good enough.
Nehru University in New Delhi for 35 years before joining the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in 2021. She's known for her work on labor markets, the informal economy, and those links to some of the macroeconomic policy. So Jayati.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. And let me say what an honor it is to be part of this opening plenary. I think it's been amazing how, as you mentioned, the Quito Organizing Committee and the overall organizing committee have managed to pull this off. I really hope that it's going to be as successful as it shows every signs of being already. And I think you're making the best possible use of what is unfortunate by bringing in many, many more people from different parts of the world to engage in it. And this actually relates directly to the kinds of intersectionality that I want to look at. I think IAFFE has been tremendous in bringing out the multidimensional nature of the relationship of gender to other social and economic processes. And as you said, we look at it in terms of class, in terms of race, ethnic group, and religion, and many other forms of discrimination and exclusion. I think one aspect that I have found more and more important in recent years especially, and which has been really brought home to me on a personal level in the last year, is that of location. So I'm going to focus on the intersectionalities created by location, and in a way, therefore, the different ways in which women in different parts of the world have experienced these multidimensional crises simply because of where they happen to be. And that's different from nationality, ethnic group, and so on. It's an additional force. And I would like to look at the impact of location both across countries and within countries, because I think both are extremely significant. And if anything, the pandemic type of crisis has shown how deeply significant they still remain. So in terms of the most important crisis that all of us have been experiencing over the last year and a half, I mean, the pandemic, the fact of the possibilities of disease and death, and the possibilities of people around you suffering, as well as the economic repercussions of all of that. There's absolutely no doubt today, and I think that's so evident that even hoary institutions like the G7 are forced to acknowledge it, that we're in very, very different worlds. There is one part of the world where it seems like a fading problem, where it seems to be under control, where the extent of vaccination and the extent of control otherwise of the disease means that this is something that can be talked about in the past. And there are other parts of the world where it has barely begun. And there are others, like my own country, which are in the throes of the crisis. I mean, it's true, the second wave has diminished a little bit in the last couple of weeks, but it's still extremely severe. And we still all know people who are dying and people who are suffering and so on. So I think one major way in which location matters is where you happen to be. I see this so much. I'm sorry to bring a personal element in here, but I moved to the United States in early October. And to me, the difference in not just my own life and possibilities, but in the situation faced by everyone around me is so stark and so shocking in a way, simply because of my location. Nothing else about me has changed. And I think that is something that we really need to constantly bear in mind. I know my friends in Ecuador and my friends across the world, I see that there's such a wonderful geographical variation of participants that brings it home to me. I think all of us will appreciate this. So certainly in terms of the disease trajectory, the extent of vaccination, the ability therefore to be protected from the disease and to know that people around you are protected, and the ability to engage once more in social life, in economic life, all of those are hugely impacted by where you are. There are 35 countries in which not a single vaccination has been administered. All of Africa, less than 2% of the population has received vaccines. 75% of the vaccines in the world have gone to just 10 countries. So that will give us some idea of the privilege that comes with the vaccination. It's a different matter that, vaccine hesitancy or other kinds of things are restricting the scope of the vaccination, even in the countries that have it. But there is that fundamental and huge difference. Now, along with that, then you get all the other implications of how the disease plays out in terms of the economic impact, but also, and again, something that is often ignored, the impact on other aspects of health. Reproductive health has been massively affected in countries which are still experiencing the pandemic in a significant way, or where the health services were basically shuttered or reduced dramatically to cater for COVID-19. In India, during the peak of the first wave of the pandemic, the institutional births, what we call deliveries in hospitals, went down by 40%. Even today we have no data on what is going on in the second wave, but the estimations are that many, many women are being denied the most basic of things, which is access to proper medical help during childbirth. And that we know is associated with much higher maternal mortality, much higher infant mortality. And in addition to that, diseases that women experience tend to get underplayed. In general, women themselves underplay it, but in general, even medical authorities get to underplay it. That's happening hugely at the moment. And so even in terms of other health considerations, where you live matters so hugely for women across the world. The other one I want to point out is related to that, the collapse of livelihoods. We know that COVID-19, the associated lockdowns, just the fact that the disease is proliferating, all of that affects your capacity to work and your ability to work. There's been a lot of discussion of how women have been disproportionately thrown out of the workforce, especially because we know that employment recovery, except in a few countries where there's been massive fiscal response, we know that employment recovery has not been complete, that in most of the developing world, even those who have got jobs again have often got it at lower money wages and in worse working conditions. But remember that informality, which of course women dominate among informal workers, but informality of work is much greater in the developing world than in the developed world. In the developing world, on average, 70% of all workers are informal, 85% of women workers are informal. And of course, Valeria has done a lot of work on this. She would be able to tell you much more about this. In the developed countries, it's the other way around. It is 25% of workers are informal and only 40% of women. I mean, it's a lot, but it's not like 85%. So what does that mean? It means that women in the developing world have not only been denied employment and livelihoods, but also there's no legal or social protection. There's nothing, there's no paid leave, there's no furlough, there's no medical leave, there's no unemployment insurance, there's nothing for women who have experienced this. And it's not just that you're getting less than the men, you're not getting it at all. And you're certainly even getting less than women who happen to be resident elsewhere. Informal work is hugely predominant even among care workers in most of the developing world. And I know that Valeria is going to talk about this in much more detail, so I'm just going to leave it there. But the huge issue of care, which has become such a big and important, which we have been talking about for decades, but finally others have also begun to notice its significance, even that has massive, massive locational implications. Associated with that decline of livelihood and employment is hunger. And I don't think we realize that there's a real hunger crisis in large parts of the developing world. 123 countries, according to FAO, are facing severe hunger. It used to be moderate to severe. Now they have downgraded everybody to severe. 123 countries facing severe hunger among the major part of the population. And this is not just least developed countries, low-income countries. My own country, India, has experienced hunger among about 80% of the population, like nothing we have experienced since independence in the past 70 years. So there is a major impact of the decline in livelihoods on hunger. And this is, the hunger thing is also affected by climate change, which is ongoing, which hasn't sort of said, okay, I'll wait in the queue. Once the pandemic is over, then I'll come. It's happening anyway. And so climate change has affected local supplies, local crops, and that in turn is affecting those countries where anyway they were excessively reliant on imports, which countries are facing foreign exchange constraints with, and therefore there's a significant increase in hunger. We all know what happens when there's overall hunger increase. It's women and girls who lose out the most. And once again, this is not uniform across women all over the world. It's locational. Another big aspect is the difference in fiscal responses between developed and developing countries. The advanced economies have gone in for the biggest fiscal responses ever. I mean, historically ever. Forget, post-depression and so on. These are the biggest massive expansions in new additional spending that we have ever witnessed. And on average, in the developing world, this is anywhere between 15 to 25% of GDP. In the developing world, for the middle income countries, it's 4 to 6% of GDP additional spending. For low income countries, it's 2%. So think of that. Now remember, those GDPs are also smaller. To give you an absolute sense of the difference, the average fiscal spending of the US government, Trump plus Biden, and not counting what is on the agenda right now that is being debated in Congress, not even counting that. The average fiscal spending has been estimated by my colleagues, it's around 25,000 per capita, 25,000 US dollars per capita. The average fiscal spending in low income countries, at least, wait for it, $2 per capita, 25,000 and $2. I don't have to tell you what that means in terms of basic services, in terms of, even the kind of health spending that we need or anything else that is required to cope with these massive catastrophes, these multidimensional catastrophes that are going on. But we can understand that this means that all the people where you have getting very, very low fiscal responses, all the people resident in those countries are not only going to not face an economic recovery because of the macroeconomic implications of this low spending, but they're also not even going to get basic public services that they got before. In other words, there's a massive wipeout of even things that existed earlier, which is now being experienced by women in the developing world, which is not being experienced by women in advanced economies. And then, of course, we have the fact that because developing countries, emerging markets, and least developed countries, which are now called frontier markets, were encouraged to join get integrated into global capital markets, that we are now at the mercy of these very volatile flows of capital, which are creating huge instability. We got a massive outflow March last year, then we started getting inflows again. Then we've got very volatile movements over the past few months. And now that the US Federal Reserve has announced that 2 years from now, they're going to raise interest rates, we are already seeing jitters in capital markets. We're already seeing outflows in many developing countries. So we're also at the mercy of extremely volatile movements of capital, which are not affected by us, they're affected by announcements in the US and in other advanced economies. And why external debt problems for which there's no attempt at resolution. G7 can't be bothered, G20 doesn't really also make any serious effort. The other global institutions that are supposed to deal with it are not doing any of that, which also means that governments are hamstrung and that the pressures on fiscal austerity are ever greater. So in the advanced economies, I see everyone around me worrying about, constraints on the current expansion and when will fiscal austerity rear its ugly head again. In developing countries, it hasn't gone away. I mean, in Argentina, they want to spend more, they are being hamstrung and prevented by the Ecuador and so on. They're being prevented by the same IMF that is telling the US, please spend more. So once again, location matters hugely, and of course it affects the conditions. All this is between countries, but of course there are massive locational differences within countries. And again, I'm just repeating things all of you know. I just want to highlight some of the big ones. I realize I'm taking too long and I will hurry it up. Rural, urban, huge. The the fact that the illness is now spreading in rural areas in many parts of the developing world is utterly terrifying, because in large parts of these areas, there's no health infrastructure that could even check who is infected, who isn't, how it is happening. Forget treatment, forget vaccination. We are talking about a complete sort of free-for-all for these viruses in a world where there isn't the basic amenities and health infrastructure that would enable some kind of pushback. But we also have more developed and less developed parts of different countries in terms of infrastructure in general. It doesn't only have to be rural and urban. There are certain provinces we all know in our own countries, sometimes not just provinces, sometimes districts, sometimes regions that are significantly less developed, more backward. And yet, because of the continuous interaction and the fact that this virus doesn't respect passports or other kinds of borders, it spreads. And of course, the economic impact spreads and has spread already. And so there is a huge difference in terms of where you are located, even within countries. I would argue that it's even more than that. I see this even here in the United States and the Northeast. I see what you could call microclimates of political economy. Certain locations like University Town, where I happen to be located right now, compared to a few miles down the road, a significantly working class neighborhood that used to be industrial, which now has lost all its industry, is rather depressed, has much more opioid incidence, has much greater unemployment, has much greater hopelessness, and much greater disease, and much greater vaccine hesitancy. Now, the conditions of the women in my university town compared to the conditions of the women in that town a few miles down the road, massively different. And exactly the same thing is happening in India, I'm sure in other developing countries, that there are these microclimates that of location, if you like, political economy microclimates that affect the conditions of women. So all this is simply just to point out that, it's one of the things which we are aware of, but perhaps we have not adequately theorized it and brought it in to our multidimensional analysis, the huge significance of location. And I just wanted to begin with that. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Jayati. When you first mentioned that you were going to talk about location, I've been thinking about the fact of how much that matters for all of us. I just flew last weekend from the UK to the US, and it's even within that, it's striking about some of these differences in location. And again, I'm the same person. So I think you're right that the theorizing about this will be really interesting. I want to turn next to Valeria Esquivel, who's an employment policies and gender specialist at the ILO. She's currently on leave from her academic position at the National University of General Sarmiento in Argentina. And her work focuses on issues around care work and time use. Valeria.
Thank you. I will do this presentation in Spanish porque soy argentina y porque es mi región. Y a pesar de que había prometido una presentación centrada en temas de cuidado, la he expandido porque estaba preocupada por otros temas y por ubicar el cuidado en el marco de otras dimensiones de la crisis. La crisis económica que derivó de la pandemia y que todavía estamos atravesando a nivel mundial no tiene precedentes, al menos desde mediados del siglo pasado. En términos de empleo, esta crisis ha implicado una pérdida de puestos de trabajo que cuadriplica la de 2008-2009, de la que el empleo tardó casi una década en recuperarse. Lamentablemente, América Latina es la región más golpeada en este momento, tanto en pérdidas de horas trabajadas como en la contracción del empleo y el aumento de la tasa de desempleo. Esta crisis además ha tenido un impacto particularmente fuerte sobre el empleo de las mujeres. Durante el año 2020, a nivel global, el empleo de las mujeres se contrajo 5%, mientras que el de los hombres lo hizo en 3,9, casi 4 puntos porcentuales. y proporcionalmente muchas más mujeres que hombres se retiraron del mercado de trabajo, en particular las jóvenes. A niveles más elevados, el mismo fenómeno se evidenció en nuestra región, en América Latina. Esto se debe a las características particulares de esta crisis. En crisis previas, el primer impacto era típicamente sobre sectores muy masculinizados, como la construcción o la industria. Luego la contracción generalizada de la demanda impactaba en el empleo de servicios, donde las mujeres están sobrerepresentadas. Y por último, el ajuste fiscal, que seguía las crisis, tendía a contraer el empleo y a deteriorar las condiciones de trabajo en la salud, la educación y la administración pública, lo cual redundaba también en el deterioro de la calidad de los servicios de cuidado y en el doble empobrecimiento de tiempo y de ingresos de las mujeres. Esta crisis, sin embargo, impactó a las mujeres también en la primera fase, ya que las restricciones impuestas para disminuir los contagios impactaron fuertemente en sectores feminizados, como el comercio al por menor, los restaurantes y las actividades turísticas, y en el empleo en el servicio doméstico, por ejemplo. En la segunda fase impactaron en sectores también feminizados de la industria, como la vestimenta. El hecho de que las mujeres, como mencionó antes Jayati, tuvieran relativamente empleos más precarios que los varones y estuvieran sobrerepresentadas entre las y los informales en la mayoría de las regiones, hizo que las mujeres perdieran el empleo, las fuentes de ingresos, con más intensidad que los hombres, aún en los sectores menos impactados. La excepción de la regla fueron los servicios de cuidado, en particular la salud, ya que en la mayoría de los contextos se conservaron e incluso expandieron el empleo para hacer frente a la crisis, aunque no siempre generando empleos de calidad y con las condiciones de seguridad necesarias. Por otra parte, esta crisis aumentó la demanda de cuidados dentro de los hogares a una escala sin precedentes. El cierre de escuelas y otros servicios de cuidado, las restricciones a la movilidad y en muchos casos el cuidado de personas infectadas con síntomas leves han generado una enorme carga de cuidado. La poca evidencia de la que disponemos indica que si bien los varones han asumido más cuidados que antes de la pandemia, las horas totales de trabajo de las mujeres, combinando trabajo remunerado y no remunerado, han llegado a niveles insostenibles. Esta pandemia ha puesto en evidencia lo que las economistas feministas sostenemos desde siempre, que el mundo no funciona sin la provisión de cuidados. 3/4 partes de las horas de cuidado no remunerados son provistas por mujeres, y no hay salud sin trabajadores de la salud, no hay escuelas sin maestras y maestros, y cuando la salud y la educación enfrentan una emergencia como la actual, pocas veces vista, ni la sociedad ni la economía siguen funcionando normalmente. En otras palabras, esta es una crisis cuya gravedad actual en América Latina se relaciona fuertemente con las condiciones estructurales de nuestra región, entre las que las inequidades de género no son una dimensión menor. En efecto, sabemos en el cuerpo en América Latina, porque las hemos atravesado, que las crisis para nosotros no son solo coyunturas profundas y tal vez no demasiado largas de deterioro de los ingresos y el empleo, sino shocks desigualadores, que una vez establecidos tienden a reproducirse. No solo porque los costos de las crisis no se distribuyen de manera pareja, sino porque quienes ganan con las crisis quieren más herramientas que antes de las mismas para sostener sus posiciones relativamente privilegiadas. También sabemos desde larga data que mujeres y varones atraviesan las crisis de manera desigual, de acuerdo con su ubicación en la estructura social y productiva, en términos de clase, etnia, territorio, localización o generación. Y también de acuerdo a las políticas que se lleven adelante para morigerar los impactos inmediatos de la crisis y para generar un sendero de reactivación inclusivo. Creo que es en la combinación de las condiciones estructurales de las economías, con las políticas que se han llevado adelante, y además las condiciones estructurales limitan en sí mismo el espacio de políticas, que se define tanto la profundidad de la crisis como la velocidad y el modo en que se sale de ellas. Y esto vale para las políticas económicas, para las de salud, para las de protección social y para las del mercado de trabajo. sin un enfoque de género explícito, es decir, sin pensar desde un principio cómo revertir los impactos diferenciales que las crisis han tenido en mujeres y varones en la etapa misma de la concepción de la política, y generar una recuperación más inclusiva y más justa, esta crisis no solo va a profundizar las desigualdades de género, sino que volverá a ponerlas al servicio del funcionamiento de una economía profundamente desigual y desigualadora. Después de este diagnóstico poco auspicioso, podía seguir en varias direcciones y tuve que decidir qué pensar. Y tomé la convocatoria a esta conferencia y la invitación a pensar en, la cito textual, nuevas visiones económicas y metodológicas dentro de las cuales las perspectivas feministas son esenciales. Y creo que me gustaría ubicar algunas de esas intersecciones, algunos temas y miradas que permiten cruzar tantos niveles de análisis como perspectivas conceptuales. Finalmente, este diagnóstico no es el único posible, y como en el diagnóstico me preocupa la estructura productiva, su relación con la producción y reproducción de desigualdades, entre ellas las de género, y las mutuas determinaciones. Y me dan esperanza los intersticios por los cuales podrían colarse algunos cambios transformadores. Voy a mencionar 3. La primera de estas intersecciones es la provisión de cuidados no remunerados, su necesidad y cotidianeidad, su persistente feminización, su condición de estructural y estructurante de la situación de las mujeres en el mercado de trabajo, no solo como barrera a la entrada, sino también para delimitar la calidad de los empleos de las mujeres en general y de las trabajadoras del cuidado en particular. En América Latina, la cobertura irregular y la calidad variable de los servicios de cuidado y la enorme inequidad de ingresos familiares hacen posible que algunos hogares contraten servicio doméstico, y que en países como Brasil, Argentina o Paraguay, el empleo doméstico pueda superar el 15% del empleo femenino. El acceso a servicios de cuidado pago se constituye de esta manera en una nueva dimensión de la desigualdad, entre hogares, entre mujeres y entre personas que necesitan cuidados. Las políticas de cuidado universales, y en particular la expansión de servicios de cuidado públicos y de calidad, podrían tener un papel central en las estrategias de reactivación. Si, a diferencia de nuestras experiencias pasadas de ajuste estructural, estas inversiones pueden sostenerse en el tiempo, las políticas de cuidado podrían ser transformadoras en el sentido de alterar, aunque más no sé un poco, las estructuras de desigualdad. La segunda intersección que me interesa proponer es que la alta proporción de trabajadoras de servicio doméstico, en general la elevada informalidad del empleo en nuestras economías, muestra que la transformación de la estructura productiva todavía es un tema pendiente. Sigue siendo el caso que la informalidad es mayor entre las mujeres que entre los varones, que ellas tienen menores oportunidades para acceder a puestos de calidad, con menor presencia en el empleo industrial y relativa mayor presencia en los servicios y en la agricultura de subsistencia. Esta segregación sectorial tiende a explicar las brechas de género que se observan tanto en los niveles de empleo y tasa de actividad como en los ingresos, y como ya dije al principio, es la principal explicación para los impactos diferenciales de esta crisis. En este sentido, las políticas de desarrollo productivo deberían hacer un esfuerzo explícito por revertir la segregación sectorial e identificar en qué sectores podrían generarse empleos de calidad para las mujeres. La tercera intersección se deriva de las dos anteriores y tiene que ver con el rol del Estado. Devuelto a la centralidad de gestor de la sociedad, de los bienes públicos como el cuidado y la salud, y mediador de los conflictos distributivos. Hacer políticas no es un ejercicio tecnocrático, es intervenir a niveles meso y macro, mediar entre intereses que pueden ser contradictorios y tener los recursos para implementarlas, algo que también mencionó Jayati. En este sentido, las políticas macroeconómicas toman especial relevancia. La prudencia macroeconómica ha llevado a algunos países en nuestra región y en el sur global a demorar la implementación de políticas de sostén de ingresos, por ejemplo para las y los informales, con la consiguiente explosión de los niveles de pobreza y a la postre el agravamiento de la situación sanitaria. Otros países llegan al límite de su espacio fiscal, que es más difícil de expandir en medio de una contracción económica generalizada, y de su capacidad de endeudamiento, aquella que exige la prudencia de la que hablaba antes. Las demandas sobre políticas que son urgentes para apaciguar la crisis se hacen difíciles de compatibilizar con procesos de cambio estructural más lentos y con condiciones de pobreza y desigualdad de larga data. A pesar de estas limitaciones profundas, enormes, creo que debemos arremangarnos e intervenir en la política macroeconómica como construcción de conocimiento y también como proyecto político feminista. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Valeria. That was wonderful. Really nice to hear you lay out some of the issues around care work. Before I move on to the next speaker, I want to remind people that if you have questions, to please go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll start putting them together. And also a reminder to feel free to tweet about the conference so we can share the conversation more broadly. So I encourage you to do both of those things. Our final speaker is Rhonda Sharpe, who's the founder and president of a think tank on equity, the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, or WISER. If you don't know about WISER yet, you will want to know much more about them after you hear her speak. Rhonda has worked to bring racial diversity into the economics profession, particularly in the US. So Rhonda.
Can you all hear me? I've switched to, yeah, great. Okay, so I am going to be the person with PowerPoint, and hopefully it won't be overwhelming. Jayati started the conversation talking about location, and I'd like to flip that just a little bit and ask us to broaden the way that we think about location, not just to be about geography, but to also think about location in terms of where people are located in the strata around social economic status and where we're located in the income distribution. And the reason that I asked us to broaden that in terms of location is generally I wink at the COVID crisis as opposed to focusing my comments on it, because I strongly believe that, or let me say not believe, I am very concerned that when everyone is, in quotation marks, vaccinated and our lives return to normal, that many of the issues that got the spotlight during COVID will again fall in the background. And so the analogy that I've been using is to remind people that when you think about performers, when they're in the spotlight, you know, we focus on them and they get their attention and we give them the clap, but we often forget that when they fall back out of the spotlight, they're still dancing, they're still performing. And so the analogy for me is, even though childcare or healthcare inequality, or even the ways in which folks live, whether or not you are you're a homeowner or you live in an apartment or in spaces where dwelling quarters have multiple people and families in a space, those issues don't go away once we are no longer focused on COVID-19. And so I just want to remind us not to forget, right, about these inequalities that have been in the spotlight around COVID. And so Cheryl said, I am the co-founder, the founder and the president of the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race. And we exist to expand women's focused research. And the reason I founded WISER was I would often look at research and I didn't see myself. And so if anyone's ever heard me speak, you will often hear me talk about seeing myself in the data. That one of the things that I think is incredibly important is that when you read a report, that you see yourself. And so you feel seen, and then you feel like whatever policy recommendations may come out of that address you. So I want to start by laying out some definitions to make sure that we're on the same page as I begin to talk about how we want to think about analyzing data, not to address issues with COVID-19, but to also address many of the inequalities that we see. So intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. It comes out of her looking at legal work around Black women finding that often Black women were caught at that intersection, right? There would be ways in which you could sue around being a woman, you could sue around being Black, but not necessarily at the intersection. The Wiser has something called Wiser Dialogue, conversations with women of color about issues, policies, and research that impact our lives. And our May guest was Alicia Netterville, and she was talking about the Pay Equity Act and how the Pay Equity Act does not operate at the intersection of race and gender, and that you can only bring a claim based on gender. And one of the things that she talked about in the conversation was sometimes it's not good to have policies that are race neutral, that you want to have policies that are targeted. My conversations and points are mainly going to be focused at the intersection of race and ethnicity. I recognize that we have an international audience. And so when I can, I am going to remind us that this also operates at the intersection of caste and religion, and other characteristics that define women in given spaces. So when I think about intersectionality, I think about it as the lens we use to interpret results, that it takes into consideration the characteristics that may influence an outcome. So an example of that is in the US, there's a lot of conversation about wealth inequality, but it's spoken about in the aggregate. So since I've used that word aggregate, I'm going to pause here and say if there are any of Cheryl Doss's students out there, because Cheryl and I have had this conversation, the way that I talk about disaggregating data is the way that Cheryl teaches you in terms of aggregating up, taking each individual observation and then how you aggregate that. The reason that I talk about disaggregating the data is because often when it is reported in the aggregate, and I want it to be reported disaggregated, not by women, not by Black. So I just wanted to throw that out there. It allows, another part of intersectionality is that it allows for framing of analysis to consider difference. But when we talk about intersectionality, we want to be very careful not to have what Adolfo Aranez, probably didn't pronounce his last name correctly, calls oppression Olympics. So we don't want to have this conversation where it's Cheryl and I talking about how we are oppressed, or I should say, who's oppressed more, or Jayati and I talking about, oh, well, if you think it's bad for an international East Indian woman in the US, walk a day in my shoes as a Black woman, right? We don't want to have intersectionality become that type of conversation. My schoolmate, Benga Adjulore, once tweeted, who you center determines or really reflects who you value in a policy situation. It's been 35 years since Julianne Malveaux and Margaret Sims published Slipping Through the Cracks. And I've been going back and taking a look at the book, and Malveaux puts in there that Bella Azuzberg, who is the woman sitting in the picture with the hat, that's Barbara Jordan speaking, Senator Barbara Jordan speaking, and not Betty Ford, Carter, Rosalind Carter sitting beside her. And she says, every issue is a woman's issue. And I think that everyone in the audience would agree with that. But here is where I think that the pivotal point happens. It is that every woman's issue is not experienced the same way by all women, which is why it is important to think about intersectionality, and it is important to think about how disaggregating data, which I will define in a moment. And in the book, Malveaux also talks about when we are thinking about who we're centering in policies, a great deal of that is a function of the politics of race, the politics of gender, and I've added the politics of caste and religion, and then as we've heard Jayati say, the politics of location, right? All of these things matter when we're talking about who we're centering in policy, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Marlene Kim's work on what she calls gendered racism, which is the intersection of race and gender stereotypes. And she talks about the fact that a lot of these stereotypes are about ethics, intellect, masculinities, leadership, and nurturing, which are ascribed by race, ethnicity, gender groups. We also know that they are a function of caste and religion and rural and even urban, as Jayati has mentioned earlier. But she also talks about how they are reinforced by so many institutions like education, gosh forbid, marriage, religion, institutions, etc. So when we talk about disaggregation of data, what we're asking people to do is to think about this is the mechanics behind how we collect and analyze data. At the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, what we want researchers and policymakers and scholars to actually think about are what are the characteristics that influence an outcome. So I mentioned earlier the conversation about wealth in the US. It's often talked about in the aggregate, white wealth, Black wealth, Hispanic wealth. Very seldom is there a conversation about wealth of Asians. What I'd like to see that conversation talk about is me. What does my wealth look like as a Black woman who is not married, does not have children, who is highly educated and own property? How does that compare to similarly situated women and men? Not just talking about wealth in the aggregate. And then because disaggregation data is the mechanics, it is going to be intersectionality that we then use to interpret the results. So I'm going to hang out here for just a second, and I want to stress an importance here. If you do not disaggregate the data, it is difficult to talk about intersectionality because your data will not be analyzed in such a way that you can talk about how race, gender, caste, religion interact to influence an outcome unless you've disaggregated the data to start with. Now that also requires that we think about this as we're collecting data. So now that I've sort of laid down what intersectional analysis is and data disaggregating, I want to talk to you about why it's important. So the first reason is it removes cultural bias. Data reported by gender assumes that white is the norm. Comparisons to men uses lived experiences of white women. Data reported by race or ethnicity assumes that men are the norm. Comparisons between race and ethnic groups uses the lived experience of men in each group. But it also does one other thing. It reveals the nuances hidden in the aggregate, which will allow for better policy solutions and, more importantly, targeted policy solutions. So there's been conversation about childcare and care work. And in the US, it's really taking front and center. And so I'm going to digress here and say, I am not averse to the conversation about childcare as someone who is childless. But what I am averse to is when we have the conversation around childcare and we talk about women going back to work, and then we couch that in a conversation about childcare as opposed to mothers going back to work. And the reason that I stress that is when we talk about women going back to work and then the conversation shifts to childcare, it negates me. It says I only have value if my womb has produced something. And I think that's incredibly flawed. And it excludes a large population of women who support families who have working parents. So if we take a look at this, one of the things that you hopefully will notice, and that is roughly if we're looking at the women, and again, this is in the aggregate, right? Because this is women, well, let me take that back. Some people will say that this is disaggregated because you see it Black, Asian, other men and women. But when I think about childcare, I also think about what does a family structure look like and what does education look like? And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how this changes. So if we look at women who have no high school diploma, you'll see that the women, and this is the proportion of Black women who reported not working because they had to provide childcare because schools or daycare centers were closed. You'll see that Black women are the highest group here. But when you look by marital status, you'll see that married and no high school diploma, that's the group that tends to be higher than never married or single and no high school diploma. And you'll see that this trend continues. Now, for those who do work around household responsibilities, this falls right into what you understand in terms of women's ability to negotiate with their spouses around childcare. Yes. When we come to high school diploma, you'll notice that this changes a little bit. You don't see Black women being the highest group. This now switches to Hispanic women and other. And other in the US tends to be anyone who doesn't see themselves in any of the other racial categories. But as you look by marital status, again, you'll see that this is the group that's the highest for Black women. Married and never married women experience this similarly. But if you look at the never married, the single group, and that's going to be women who are either divorced or widowed, right? That is this group here, or separated. That's the green group. Notice that they report this at a lower rate than other groups, and that's also something that we see. Now, here is the part that I thought was pretty amazing, and again, explains why we need to be mindful of who we're talking about when we're talking about women and why disaggregation is important. Because when we come to the bachelor's degree, we see that the women who are reporting childcare being the issue now is women who are Asian. And if you are Asian, you know that that is, again, a catch-all group, right? And that there's a good deal of diversity. So I'm going to pause here and say with the household public survey files, they don't disaggregate this data finally so that you can take a look to see if there's a particular Asian group of women who are being impacted. And I'm not even sure that I can even take a look at this in the granular level for occupations. And you'll also see that this is happening if we're looking by marital status. Right? That when we start thinking about adding education into this, it's varied, right? That women who are married with a bachelor's degree are reporting this as a much higher level. Now, I'm not going to get too much into the weeds about why I think this is happening, except for one of the phenomena that tends to happen in the US is that people buy houses based on schooling. And so if you have a situation where you purchased a home or you moved to a space to have access to good schools, then that generally means that you have a pretty nice career. And if your schools close, that becomes a challenge. It is also something I think important to mention here about childcare that Fatima Gross-Graves, who is the president of the National Women's Law Center, mentioned, and that is that we don't often think about schools as childcare, and that created a good deal of challenges in the US when schools shut down. So I advocate for the use of disaggregating data because we only focus on exclusion as it relates to education, employment, healthcare, and housing. And we don't actually think about it's also rooted in how data are collected and reported. And again, it allows us to see the nuances in outcome, and intersectionality allows us to interpret these nuances by framing them in difference, and it minimizes othering, right? Where we're centering on a particular group. So I'm about to wrap up. I pull this out of Slipping Through the Cracks because 35 years later, I think this is quite valid. And so Malvo says, proponents of the Women's Equity Act, for example, failed to note that certain provisions of that act focus on the status of upper and middle income women, ignoring the status of income women. For me, that's a location where you are in the income and social economic status strata. She continues to say, a sensitivity to the breadth of women's coalition might have suggested by placing more efforts on those provisions of that bill that all women could have supported, such as daycare provisions, which brings us right back to the conversation that we're having. And she says similar efforts that job creation, which usually have a positive effect on the Black community, usually focus on public works jobs. So if you're paying any attention to the infrastructure bill, that gets us back to that. So I want to wrap up by saying intersectionality is not new to feminist research. I'd encourage you to look at the special issue edited by Rose Brewer, Cecilia Conrad, and Mary King. it is also important to notice the difference between how women advocate for policies. White women tend to advocate for policies that address gender, being a woman. Other women tend to advocate for policies by the ways that they are oppressed. And again, this is in a racial context, Black or other racialized women. I'd also like to encourage you to think about the ways that we can shift the frameworks to analyze, to be more inclusive. And an example of that is a recent paper by Nina Banks, where she offers an alternative framework for thinking about unpaid work, in particular, the ways that Black women gather to provide community services. And she says that in particular, that feminist theory and the theory of the firm do not allow for multiple forms of oppression, racism, and exclusion from the household and the community experienced by women. And then my final thought is to remind you of Rhonda Williams, who I think passed away in 2000, so it's been more than 21 years. So I start with her, or end with her, should I say, because she's a strong advocate about thinking about intersectionality by race, gender, sexual identity, and caste. And in Feminist Economics, you can read a tribute about Rhonda Williams written by Lee Badgett. And I also would like to end with her because as a Rhonda Williams scholar, which is recognized for those of us who are working at the intersection of activism and scholarship. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rhonda. So now you all know why I'm always excited to talk to Rhonda about data. Those of you who know that I'm really interested in data will know why we have really interesting conversations. So I'm not seeing questions in the chat at the moment. And that seems really surprising to me given who's in the audience. But maybe what we can do is if people want to raise hands and speak and ask a question, I think we've got a manageable size group to be able to do that. So as you start to think about those, I thought I would give the panelists, if you wanted to say anything first in response to each other's presentations. Rhonda's had the chance to respond to both of the earlier ones, but do either of you want to jump in with something?
Can I?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. And thank you both, Valeria and Rhonda, for these really fascinating and very, I mean, just spot on presentations. Yeah, I was actually thinking now in terms of policy and what Valeria mentioned. And in a way, also Rhonda was talking about that, you know, policies have to be sensitive to all of these different dimensions and to the intersectionality and so on. And I am thinking back now to something that I found very telling in Nancy Fulgray's new book on, you know, the rise and decline of patriarchal systems. And I think Nancy's in the audience, so maybe she could also come in on this. That, you know, in a way, we're not going to get policy changes without broader coalitions. And while we have to recognize the differences, we also have to recognize that we have to bring many, many more people together, women and men, to be arguing for the kinds of things that Valeria mentioned and, or, you know, that all of us know about. So when we recognize intersectionality, what do we do about ensuring that we can still capture the coalitions? I think is an issue that we're always dealing with. I know that exactly as Rhonda said, you know, so many policies are pushed by particular, often more articulate women coming from the relative elite because they're the ones who are able to lobby for and demand and so on, which end up being a little insensitive perhaps to perhaps the completely different policies from what are required elsewhere. So I'm wondering how we bring in the facts of intersectionality with the obvious necessities for coalition. So actually, that's throwing it out there.
Rhonda, go ahead.
Valeria, go ahead.
Okay, I was going to say, and I like to respond to that in some ways, and to say that I think part of the challenges with coalitions is sometimes the way that they're informed, that they're formed, and what the issues are, and then as more folks come in, not being mindful of, maybe mindful is not the right word, respectful, I think, of the ways that people experience the same issue, right? And so then it makes it very easy to distraction or to fall off, right? And so as I often hear people talk about the women's movement, or if we hear people talk about the feminist movement, like the various waves, those, a lot of that started from a larger coalition that then felt that their experiences weren't being respected and acknowledged. So I think for me, it is sometimes not about bringing more folks in. It is about how do you manage to be respectful of the folks who come to the table at the beginning. And I think that is the beauty of intersectionality, to be able to, well, maybe I should say the beauty and the curse, right? It's the beauty that people can then talk to you about their experiences. I think the difficulty is that we fall into the oppression Olympics, right? How do you bring folks together and not have them be dismissive of other folks' experiences? For me, I think that's the issue. It's getting folks in a coalition to be respectful, that everyone's experience doesn't have to look like yours to have value. That to me is the problem.
If I may, Cheryl, on one hand, I think that the care agenda is in Latin America, is a good experience or example of moving forward coalitions, especially because different actors with stakeholders in the matter, those who provide services as paid workers, those who provide services and paid care work, the women's movement, but those movements that represent persons with disabilities or worried about childcare came together. And it's a win-win situation, and that's fine. Having said that, I believe in political processes when we are thinking about the macro. I mean, it has many more mediations that simply coming together. And political traditions and different interests are at stake, which are associated to resources. That's why I'm really worried about this crisis as unequalizing shock, because when you unequalize in one, then the future is at stake. A crisis is not something that is short, happens, and you were somewhere and go back to a similar place after having some bruises. That's not how it works, at least not in Latin America. And in the past, the crises were, and Argentina were expert in crises, but every crisis left us in a lower escalon, in a lower stage, and make it harder to go back to a pre-crisis equality or poverty situation. So I'm worried, and that is because those who benefit can stay and benefit and can defend their privileged positions. That really worries me, how that then fits into also the political system. I don't have the answer to that, Jayati, I think, but I surely think that this is a political challenge, not a technocratic one. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. We've got a couple questions from people. So Valeria, we've got a question for you, that you said in 2020, the decline in women's employment is 5% and women's 3 to 4%. At least that's what came through in the translation, and whether that's global or Latin America. So if you could tell us what those numbers are again.
Yes, it was global. I said Latin America was greater levels, but I didn't give, and that was for 2020, and global countries have different levels, of course. But yes, that's the ILO data for 2020 compared to 2019.
And then kind of a question, but saying it seems like women's positioning as essential workers has protected them somewhat from employment losses. Want to comment on that?
That's true for health and education, in particular when those were provided by the state. Not necessarily if it was private or it was very low, but yes. So in a way, the combination was sectors that were losing employment and women in informal positions that lost, no matter what sector, plus a few sectors that were protected, in particular for women's employment care sectors, protected, but at the forefront of risks and many times working without the due protection to their health and taking lots of risks. Yes.
Before we move on, I want to like piggyback on that and the whole conversation about essential workers. I think that is also one of those that is a key place for disaggregation, right? In the US, this conversation about essential workers, it is really key for people to think about essential workers who have to leave their homes or had to leave their homes to have contact with the public, and essential workers who could stay at home to perform their jobs. And even in the folks who had to leave their homes to interact with the public, as Valeria was saying, having access to personal protection equipment, right? We saw disparities there. And a lot of that, I think, centered around, again, education and class. If you think about as the vaccine has rolled out, what I've seen in the US is the first people that they showed us getting the vaccine were healthcare workers. They weren't the cashiers, right? They weren't the people in the supermarkets. They weren't restaurant workers. They were hospital folks. And so I think that as we're thinking about essential workers, we want to be really careful not to lump them in one group. I've often referred to that some of those groups are expendable, and we knew that they were expendable by the way in which they receive personal protection equipment. And I'd also say, as we're thinking about the rollout of vaccines, we're also seeing how we view lower wage workers who we see as essential. They're also expendable. So, that's that catch-all group. We really need to take a step back and think about who's in that, disaggregate those occupations, not only by gender, but also by wage, and then what the resulting class may be.
Great. I've got 2 hands up, I believe, Alicia, and then Karen.
Cheryl, there was actually IPEC had some more questions as well.
Okay.
I'll get to that one. I've got it.
Okay.
I'm going to do a couple people who are, so Alicia, go ahead.
Ok, bueno, pues es un gusto, voy a hablar en español para poder expresar mejor mis ideas. Felicito esta plenaria, y algo que me parece que es muy importante para las economistas feministas es trabajar lo que es la macroeconomía y cómo la macroeconomía influye en los hogares, principalmente en la microeconomía, pero pasa por la mesoeconomía, que son las políticas públicas. Y el gran drama que estamos viviendo, y voy a tratar de ser lo más sintética, son todas las políticas de austeridad que se han implementado a través de los bancos centrales, no solamente desde 2008-2009, ante la gran crisis financiera internacional, sino las políticas de austeridad y de planes de estabilización que se vienen implementando desde hace 50 años. Y por eso es que cuando Valeria dice que Argentina ha tenido infinidad de crisis, yo diría que México y América Latina han sido los grandes laboratorios de todas las políticas de austeridad, de estabilización del Fondo Monetario Internacional. Llegamos ahora a la pandemia, a COVID, y el resultado es decir, ¡ay, qué barbaridad! ¿Cómo estábamos? ¿Qué mal están los sistemas de salud? ¿Qué mal está la educación? Las mujeres en la economía informal, 60% de la población económicamente activa está en la formalidad en América Latina, y es lo mismo que podríamos decir de la India, tal como lo dijo Jayati, y de otros países del sur global. Efectivamente, en mi opinión, es cómo los presupuestos en estos países del sur global se han canalizado principalmente a trasladar todo un capital enorme, a exportar capital para pagar una deuda impagable. O sea, el cuento de García Márquez, de Heréndida, y la deuda que de alguna manera le ocasiona su abuela, es el cuento de América Latina y de los países del sur global. Cuando vemos simplemente la deuda que estamos pagando a los grandes inversionistas institucionales, a los grandes bancos comerciales e incluso al Fondo Monetario Internacional, jamás, si no hay una renegociación por parte de nuestros gobiernos y de seguir luchando por esa cancelación de deudas impagables, jamás vamos a poder canalizar a lo que es el sector de salud, al sector de educación y a una mejor alimentación. A mí me parece que esto es fundamental, que como economistas feministas veamos la irracionalidad de seguir disminuyendo el déficit público, y esto está en el documento de la Comisión Económica para América Latina. El año pasado hay una cita específicamente en uno de los documentos que fue publicado en octubre, donde América Latina es el gran ejemplo porque ha reducido el déficit fiscal, cuando definitivamente deberíamos de tener otra opinión sobre lo que debe de hacer el Estado, las políticas públicas y cancelar esa posición de los bancos centrales por restringir los presupuestos. Es un tema candente, yo me quedo con esto y muchísimas felicidades a esta extraordinaria plenaria. Gracias, Cheryl.
Thank you, Alicia. I'm going to go to let Karen make some comments. We've got various things going on in the chat, comments and questions. We don't have any plan to translate those, but if anybody out there can just translate them in real time or take turns or whatever, translate any of them that you want from Spanish to English or vice versa, that would be great. We'll take your comments and see if we can make that work that way. So Karen.
Hi there, thanks for letting me speak. I was waving to the child. Hi. Thank you very much for bringing these very interesting topics together to IAFFE for this opening plenary, the intersectionality and the global crisis. I think it's really very worthwhile. The first bit I wanted to ask, considering intersectionality and solidarity, it's not just that we are different people in different locations with different demographics. Also, the concepts might mean something quite different. For instance, if you talk about care in the queer community, if you think about Foucault, he was like theorizing care from a friendship and community perspective. For the queer community, the nuclear family care makes no sense, right? We're talking about completely different things. And in this crisis we saw, even though, you know, we had the lockdowns in Europe and stuff, the queer community was very, very isolated. If you didn't have a partner, you were on your own for weeks and weeks and weeks. Because, you know, the different organization of your life, you know, it backfires. And then not only like in the crisis now we're all vaccinated and things are great, but what Valeria was actually mentioning, these long-term effects that make a crisis, the political movements in Europe now, I'm glad the child is gone, but in Hungary, it's now illegal for me to speak about gay issues. You know, we must not advertise these things in front of children. And this has been happening quietly, just like the indigenous movements in Latin America. You know, these communities are being smashed in this neoliberal aftermath of the economic fallout. So I think it's very important to bear this in mind, what is going on in the wake of this economic restructuring. It's quite dreadful. Thank you for letting me speak.
Karen, thank you for bringing in another set of issues. That's really helpful. I have a question for Jayati.
I wanted to pick up on something that she said around care. And that is, you know, when I hear her talk about care in the queer community is not similar to the nucleus family, and that for many folks in the pandemic, you were by yourself. At which time that if you are a single person, right, that looks very similar. And again, it goes to my point when she says care has a different meaning depending on the community, that when you bring folks together, if we don't recognize, right, that for queer households and single households, being alone or caring for friends and not necessarily children needs to be valued, I think is something that often creates problems, which is why I made the comment earlier about childcare. I would love to see that conversation be broader about care, right? And I don't know if Heidi is in the audience, but I remember asking Heidi how things were going, and she mentioned that they had brought her aging mother home because they didn't want her in a senior facility. And I think there are a number of households that brought home senior folks. So it wasn't just about childcare, but it was about elder care or a care of a family/loved one that is also important in this conversation about care work.
And I was really struck in the earlier lockdowns, when we think about location actually meant your physical household, right? Your physical house and the conditions of your physical house, how much space you had and how many people you had in it made a huge difference for people's well-being, right? Talking with people about whether they had a garden for their children to go out in or not made a huge difference for people's well-being, and how many people were there, right? And so this, Jayati was talking about sort of these microclimates of political economy, but I don't think I've ever experienced that sense of the kind of the household that I live in and the physical quality of the space mattered as much as it did when we couldn't go out for 3 months.
But in the case, just to follow up, Cheryl, in the case of Latin America, with and in many other parts of the world, in which you have huge proportions of our cities, which are big and lack infrastructure, and people live, I mean, let alone gardens, with no water and with far off from transportation and with security issues and violence issues. Isolating yourself or stay at home didn't, in some context, didn't even make sense. And in fact, it was the community ties that kept the livelihoods. But the result was that you couldn't control COVID because of that. And then this pandemic, even on health issues, was not equalizing at all. Of course, I mean, no one has guarantee that if we get COVID, we will be okay. But certainly the death ended up being, and the contagion ended up being mostly more prevalent among those who were not able to protect themselves from contagion. And as it is in the US, with the workers that couldn't get leave and stay at home, or had to go with symptoms to work. In Latin America, the case of people trying to make their living in informal markets and couldn't stay home was also something I referred to when I was saying that it backfired in the livelihood sense and also in the contagion. So yes.
Right. I wasn't trying to downplay the people who couldn't leave.
No. It's not an Olympics either. Yeah.
Yeah. Jayati?
Right.
You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. No, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that have already been talked about. There's a very interesting discussion on essential work in the chat. And I think there's a very profound point made by, is it Ligia from the Young Scholars Conference? There's a huge difference between essential work and essential workers. And what we have found in many, many developing countries is that the workers are not essential. And I think that's the point. In other words, yes, that work is essential, but because it's a slack labor market, because you decide that a lot of it is low skilled, you can actually keep dumping workers. And this is what has happened. So a disproportionate number of so-called essential workers in care, in frontline health services, etc., in developing countries have either lost their jobs or not been paid for months, or, and forget about protective equipment and everything, as was already mentioned. So, it's not the case, I think, because certainly in India, I know, but it's not just in India, across many parts of the developing world now, many of these even government-driven scheme workers are not called workers because they're not paid minimum wages. So they're called volunteers or, various different names, and they're given honoraria. And so there's a huge stratification even within the care sector. And very significant numbers of these, they're kind of like piece rate or time rate work, or they're casual, they don't have any of the privileges and facilities, even though they're doing public work. And we find that in many countries, these have either disproportionately losing jobs, so that the ones who remain in jobs have had to overwork themselves and been underpaid. And this brings me to the second point Alicia made very significantly, Alicia Giron, the point about that, the responses depend on the structure of budgets fundamentally. And so, yes, there are the global pressures, absolutely. And many countries that want to do things like Argentina, right, Valeria, are being unable to do that despite, or less able to do that because of the constraints posed by the external, capital flows, debt, IMF, etc. But there are variations. In other words, the domestic political economy has generated some countries that have done better. And that brings me to Ipek's question. I think Ipek asked, are there any countries that have actually done something that have been, sort of gender sensitive in any way? I'm just listing the few that I know of, and there are probably more. But I mean, Vietnam, I know, has actually been much more successful, not just in containing the virus, but in providing adequate protection of livelihoods, of incomes, and of the basic health facilities, of other health facilities, all the other things that have really gone for a toss in many other developing countries. Within India, the state of Kerala, we have a federal system, so state governments also have, are in fact the ones in charge, the responsibility for health. Kerala had an exceptional health minister and a progressive left front-led government. And they were instrumental in making sure that there were essential goods and services provided to everyone, universal, without demanding, this condition, that you meet this, you have that card, or you have this definition. And this was even migrant workers who had come from other states to Kerala. So in other words, we didn't have the extreme calamities, the catastrophes that have befallen people in other parts of the country, because basic support services were provided, food was provided, health services were provided, there was door-to-door delivery of these things. And there were attempts to make sure that significant parts of care work that were absolutely ignored in other parts of the country were actually maintained and expanded. So yes, a lot of it has to do with political motivation. The surprising thing is Brazil. Despite Bolsonaro, the fact that the Brazilian Congress put in very, very large support grants over this period, which disproportionately benefited the poor. I mean, despite, as I said, Bolsonaro, you actually got a political configuration that was focused on zero hunger and on minimum income support. Now, was it gender sensitive? Not fully, no, but two of the critical things that I have mentioned, the collapse of livelihoods and other kinds of health facilities and food, which are so important in the rest of the world, those were actually at least maintained during that period. It's now that you're getting once again to the austerity part, and you're going to once again get a pressure on that kind of spending. I think Argentina, right, Valeria, you know more than me, right? They have already in place very, very significant structures and strategies to ensure that kind of social protection. And they're trying to maintain that even though everything is operating and the IMF is doing its damnedest to prevent them, and creditors are doing their damnedest to prevent them, they're still trying to maintain it. So yes, there are, I would say, relative success stories within these broader tragedies. And so much depends, as Alicia said, on the structures of budgets and the ways in which governments operate, which of course depends on the political economy of those places. So.
Valeria, let me let you say a little bit more about Argentina if you want, but there's also a question for you about what is your opinion regarding universal basic income as a measure for reactivating the economy, as a measure that facilitates greater connection between women and the labor market, and as a measure that opens possibilities of choice. So I'll let you kind of go anywhere you want with that.
why thrown on me? But Jayati, yes, I was thinking, Jayati, you should mention Argentina. No, but because in spite of those limitations that have emerged really this year, and macroeconomic tensions that are associated with the dollarized economy and inflation, yet there was this intention to support informal workers and go to everyone that would sign in. And in fact, as has happened in the past, the government expected a number, and the people that showed up were 3 times, and they covered everyone. And also they did many things to really keep women and men attached to their employment when it was formal, and support their income when they were informal. So in that sense, I think it is an example of political will and also of tensions, because in order to finance those policies, it's complicated if you have the debt situation Argentina has, and passing a tax to the wealthy was super complicated. It was passed, but it was super complicated, and that I was referring to that when I said there are tensions about resources and funding. On the universal basic income proposals, we could start a conversation about that, and I'm not that convinced, I have to say, and I'm not that convinced because I think that the moment you disconnect the labor market from the incomes, there is something that gets disconnected in the labor market that should be regulated. Having said that, I have just said that Argentina's policy of supporting incomes for the informal at that crisis time was the right policy to take. So those are 2 different things. One is the emergency, and another is whether in normal times you go for universal basic income, as opposed to, because resources are not infinite, as opposed to other protections through social protection systems and other ways of supporting livelihoods. But certainly, I know there are many opinions, so that's not the last word. Thank you.
There's a note in the chat that universal basic income is going to be discussed on Friday morning in the gender and poverty session. A lot of these issues that we're talking about, many of you in the virtual room will be presenting papers talking about these. So take a look and see what else is available.
One point I just want to make on the universal basic income. I'm with Valeria on this, that, I think normal times, there are different kinds of social protection. But right now, in the pandemic, you have to see this as compensation, not as a gift or a welfare or a social protection. These are governments preventing you from earning your livelihood. So you have to compensate those who have been denied the possibility of earning their livelihood. I think it's a very different situation right now.
Cheryl, I also want to chime in. And since we were talking about location, something that Jayati said earlier about developing versus developed countries and essential workers and what that looks like, I want to caution that in both spaces, there is a population that is undervalued. It just looks different, right? It may be informal workers in developing countries, and in developed countries, it's low-wage workers, right? But both of those groups are incredibly vulnerable to, dare I say, shocks, that economic shocks, and we want to be mindful of that and not sort of make it seem that, again, oppression Olympics, that it is worse in this space than it is in the other, right? They are similar populations in those spaces that are undervalued and incredibly vulnerable. So just want to caution us to not think about it as developing versus developed. And I think the other part is what Valeria was saying about political will, which we saw in the US. And I'm seeing a lot of the conversations talk about how bad the US is and a variety of things, to remind people that the US did have the pandemic unemployment assistance, which for the first time provided unemployment benefits to small business owners and contractors and gig workers, people who normally wouldn't get unemployment benefits. And I think a lot of that in the US was around avoiding a recession similar to the Great Recession. And so when I have thought about COVID, both in terms of people and economically, it just makes me think about how we will respond around the vulnerable populations. And I'd really like to see a lot of our frameworks that we talk about think more about how the healthcare talks about vulnerable populations, who they are, and how we serve them, as opposed to some of the conversations that pivot around race and gender, which, if we're coming back to coalitions, I think it makes it harder to get people to join, but we all may view ourselves as vulnerable in any given situation.
Let me weigh in with a comment from somebody, and then I'll come back to you, Valeria. But Nancy Fulbury wrote in saying, when Jayati was talking about the effective support policies, and that those were really interesting, and how do those relate to the coalition issue? How does thinking about those kind of policies take us in a new place? Valeria, let me go to you, who had your hand up, and then we can tie these all together.
Okay, no, because on vulnerability, I'm so very much fighting against collapsing vulnerability with women, so very much, almost every day, in the sense that in some positions, we are made vulnerable. We are not vulnerable in and of ourselves. And in that sense, in political terms, and I believe that coalition building can allow any strategy, including the coming together of the vulnerable. That's not what I'm discussing. I am strongly because this idea of women and vulnerable and women, young, this idea of collapsing everything that is not a white man, I just don't believe it helps us. But this pandemic showed how many women were in such positions that when it hit, it made us lose, or made these women lose their jobs, their livelihoods, and the quality of life. And so I've succeeded in making my colleagues speak about the hard-hit sectors and the hard-hit groups. So it's not them, it's the crisis that has impacted them. Mm-hmm. I wanted to react to this vulnerability thing that's getting my nerves every day.
Cheryl, could I respond to a comment here by Christina? I just,
can I jump in for you just a second? Then Valeria, you're really going to be upset, because what we're really working on right now is a framework to shift the focus to being on race and gender, to focus more on vulnerable populations like the health sector does. But it is not suggesting that women are vulnerable. It is more to talk about, as you would talk about these sectors, but to think about what is it about that sector that makes the people there vulnerable, not necessarily that women are vulnerable.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to respond to Christina from Greece, who has been talking. I mean, she mentioned the issue of unpayable debt and the severe austerity measures that basically, and the reforms, the so-called structural reforms that destroy institutions, destroy capacities, destroy the ability to do anything, and the kinds of despair you would feel. And I think really, in a sense, Valeria's discussion of Argentina is the answer. That's what can happen. In other words, Argentina it's almost like Chile, right? The crucible of neoliberalism, certainly in Latin America, where they did everything. They destroyed pretty much everything that could be destroyed in terms of basic, the kinds of role of the state that we see. And yet it was rebuilt, and significantly, right? To the point where even Macri could not destroy it, and to the point where these are now available to be used in a crisis, which I think is a huge thing. And that then brings me to Nancy's point about the coalitions, that it was that overall destruction which affected so many different categories of vulnerable people who were made vulnerable by those neoliberal strategies that created the coalition. And I think that's really, in a way, the hope that, these broad spectrum crises, if you like, are so broadly devastating that they could well create newer coalitions that we're possibly not even aware of at the moment to actually fight back against these tendencies.
I will say, Valeria, the one that sets me off in that kind of way is I do a lot of work around agricultural development. And there's still, in a huge number of proposals that you read, say that we're going to target so-and-so and women and other marginalized groups. I think there must be something that, it's a phrase that you can just randomly stick into proposals and various other things that assumes all women are marginalized and we can lump them in with other marginalized groups. And that's the one that just makes me crazy and makes me write things in the margins and scream and shout about that.
So imagine how I feel when I see someone say a woman of color. And I'm Black, right? I think that's right. Another one of these catch-all phrases that erases the lived experiences of Asian, Black, Hispanic, or as Nina Banks has reminded me, even when people say non-white, that we forget even in that you're centering white women, right? By using the term non-white, right? All of the ways I think that we erase who folks are. And it's never clear to me whether it's out of laziness, ignorance, but it is incredibly harmful. And I say to folks, don't call me a woman of color, to know that I am, and for me, I'm a Black woman who's in America, tells you a lot about my lived experiences and the way that I experience things. But I wholeheartedly agree with you. There's so many reporters and researchers that will just go women of color, or when I hear a person of color say, oh, as people of color, as a person of color, and I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, where did we begin to adopt that? And I don't see really any other groups. Now, granted, I don't often see white women say as white women. They will just say as a woman. And the assumption is woman is white. And that, I think that's part of the conversation around policy, intersectionality, and crises that we don't talk about, right? Like, who is assumed to be a woman, Valeria, when we're talking about vulnerability, right? That often isn't all women that we're talking about.
Right. Great. I think we're going to need to start to wrap this up. There's a number of comments in the chat, but I'm going to let you read those rather than having me read them out. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. Let me just invite the panel if you want to say any last thing before we close this session. Let me invite you to do that.
There have been so many fascinating things put in the chat that I think we really have to preserve this chat and think about some of the issues that have been raised. It's a peculiar advantage of the Zoom system that you actually get many more people able to put in things that we can think about afterwards. And that's a huge, huge thing. I want to get back in a way peculiarly. I began this session being a little bit more pessimistic about coalitions because of the intersectionality. I'm ending it much more optimistic. So I have to thank all of you for that.
I also, in a way, I hope that the 100 and something that we are had turned on their cameras because I know many friends are there, but there are very few with their cameras on. I don't know if it collapses or not, but it's been great to feel that we had the time to have a meaningful conversation in spite of these Zoom times, and it felt almost like we had been in Quito. So to me, thank you very much, Cheryl, for inviting me to this.
So no surprise, I'm really going to be the eyeball again to say that I am loving Zoom. And that is because I often feel that there is a connection that you get to make that you don't necessarily get in person because people form cliques and they're off in their own groups. And what I feel in the Zoom world is just the space of the chat where people seem to feel far more comfortable putting the questions in and asking you to think. So I may not pronounce your name correctly, Thuydo. Wrote about intersectionality being focused on direct causes of oppression. And what I'd like to say to that is, for us as the Women's Institute of Science, Equity, and Race, what we ask for people to think about are what are the characteristics that influence the outcome, right? And that for me would include all the things that we've already talked about. Where are you located geographically? Urban, suburban, developed, developing? Where are you located in terms of economic and social economic status? And then what are the politics of the space that you are in? When you take into consideration all of that, and then think about disaggregating data and then come back for intersectional lens to analyze those outcomes, I think it does allow you to incorporate the indirect causes if you stop to think about what influenced the outcome first. So but I do want to thank you for that question, because it is going to make me rethink when I talk about intersectionality, not just to encourage people to also think about what I would say was playing in the background, right, to create those situations, those indirect characteristics. So thank you, Cheryl, for inviting me for this.
Well, thank you, the three of you, for speaking, and for all of you who asked questions. I know that my head is now full, which is kind of a problem since it's session 1 that I need to go think for a while. But I think one of the things I always love about coming to the IAFFE meetings is that it's a place where people can raise questions, challenge each other's ideas, almost always in a really respectful way, to hear really different perspectives on what sets you off in terms of thinking about the language that we use, as well as the ideas that we use. So I want to just really thank the three of you, and really looking forward to the rest of the conference. I've got some announcements and housekeeping, which I have to think about what housekeeping means when you're talking about this at a feminist economics conference. It is part of my unpaid work to do all of these announcements, and less of but it's quite critical. And then to say that following this is going to be, Carmen Diana is going to introduce it, but a concert, so that you by an Ecuadorian choir. So don't run away yet. So a few housekeeping things. One is that I would encourage you all to play on Whova, which is the kind of the front end that we're using for the conference. There are all kinds of ways to connect on it. It's not the same as sitting down for a coffee or going out for a walk and doing those things together. But there's the messaging service, so you can message anybody who's at the conference. As well as anybody who's spoken, you can directly contact them. There's the community space where you can go and meet with people, hang out in a virtual space together and chat with people. You can see the Twitter feed. Andrea also asked me to tell you all to keep an eye out and watch the messages from the people organizing the conference, because there's all kinds of updates and various other kinds of things. So that's a great resource. And some of those things can happen not synchronously, so that those of you who are getting ready to go to bed pretty soon, because it's getting late, you can leave messages, and people who are up early because they're in different parts of the world can answer them and respond then. So take advantage of the kinds of opportunities this offers, even though we're missing the other ones. I wanted also to say that one of the real challenges of doing this particular conference was organizing the contributed papers and putting them in sessions. For any of you who have ever tried to organize a conference, and I know many, many of you have, it's always a challenge if you just accept papers based on quality and ones you want to hear, and then trying to put them into sessions. So we always have that problem. And this year we had the particular problem that people could only do it in particular time slots. So every time I was like, oh, there's these 4 papers would fit together really well, I couldn't put them into a particular time slot, because one of them could only do it in the day one, and one could only do it in the morning one. So I would just encourage you that as you're going to those sessions, to think about this as an opportunity. Some of the sessions are quite coherent, and many of them are less so in part because of the time challenges. I would just ask you to take this and see it as an opportunity to hear things that you wouldn't ordinarily hear, meet people that you wouldn't ordinarily meet in a session, and just take advantage of it. We did the absolute best we could, and it feels like it wasn't as good as I would have liked it in many of those. And we have too many sessions at the same time, too many great things that people wanted to do. And I know that some of you will be asleep when some of them are going on. They're all going to be recorded, and so you can catch up with them, watch them, pick the ones that you want to participate in, but you can go afterwards. You can go tonight while some people are sleeping. You can listen to some of the sessions that you missed. So I just encourage you to take advantage of that. That's something we don't ever record them typically when we're meeting in physical spaces. And my other one is that one of the promises I made 2 years ago when I was president of IAFFE was to start a discussion about how to support our colleagues who were facing challenges and repercussions from living and working under, I'm going to call them increasingly authoritarian regimes, right? We had lots of discussions about what was happening at JNU and how IAFFE should respond to it. And so as part of fulfilling my promise to get those conversations going, we're going to have a session tomorrow to talk about doing research in these kinds of contexts. And the issue of Hungary came up earlier. How do we do this, and how can we support each other? So you're welcome to come to that session, or you can listen to the recording of it, but I would really hope that that's part of an ongoing conversation. It got dropped a little bit because of some of the other things that were going on that were immediate and that we were dealing with, but that's a piece that I think we all need to have conversations about. For me, that's not where I'm working, but all my students are going and working in those places and trying to struggle with some of those issues. So I'm really excited about the session tomorrow. There are tons and tons of other sessions that I'm excited about as well. So looking forward to seeing many of you at them. And so let me just then wrap up, and I'm going to turn it over to Carmen Diana, who is going to introduce what happens next.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. The Keto Committee has organized 3 events this week. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock, Keto time, we have the Latin American plenary. Today at 12:30 Keto time, we have a special roundtable on Ecuador and how the crisis is specifically affecting that country. And now we're delighted to bring you a taste of Ecuadorian culture. the University Choir of the Central University of Ecuador, which is the largest public university in Ecuador. We had hoped to bring you a live concert, but the pandemic and technical challenges made that impossible. The director of the University Choir, Maestro Cesar Chavin Hidalgo, has put together a selection of their music and has pre-recorded a message of welcome. Jiki.
Soy César Chauvin Hidalgo y a nombre del coro de la Universidad Central del Ecuador, que me honro en dirigir, reciban un afectuoso saludo todas y todos los participantes al 29º Congreso Anual de la Asociación para la Economía Feminista, Sostenibilidad de la Vida, Retos en un contexto de crisis multidimensional, auspiciado por varias instituciones ecuatorianas, entre ellas la Universidad Central del Ecuador. Escuchen a continuación con el coro de la Universidad Central del Ecuador, música ecuatoriana. Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Qué bonito La luz en tus ojos arde, si no sabes amanecer, y si los cielos parecen que va muriendo la tarde, y si los cielos parecen que va muriendo la tarde, la luz en tus ojos arde, si no sabes amanecer, y si los cielos parecen que va muriendo la tarde, y si los cielos parecen que va muriendo la tarde, las penas que a mí me matan son tantas que se atropellan y como en la tormenta se agolpan unas a otras en moderación me matan, las penas que a mí me matan son tantas que se atropellan y como en la tormenta se agolpan unas a otras en moderación no me matan, no me matan, no
Cevapta gelemedi. Ondan sonra bunu yaptık. Amor, amor, amor que se ha de acabar. Amor, amor, amor que se ha de acabar. Amor que se ha de acabar, ay, 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 que se debe de una vez. Amor que se ha de acabar, ay, 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 que se debe de una vez.
del perejil, manitas del perejil, y guam, ra, la, 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 tum, tum. Si mis gratitudes fueran de aceite, si mis gratitudes fueran de aceite, yo viviría manchado a brincar continuamente. Amor, amor, amor que se ha de acabar. Amor, amor, amor que se ha de acabar. Amor que se ha de acabar, ay, 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 que se acabe de una vez. Amor que se ha de acabar, ay, 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 que se acabe de una vez.
calma con los años, cambia el pastor su rebaño, y así como todo cambia, que yo cambie no es extraño. Cambia el más fino brillante, de mano en mano su brillo, cambia el nido el pajarillo, cambia el sentir un amante, cambia el rumbo el caminante, aunque esto le cause daño, y así como todo cambia, que yo cambie no es extraño.
Todo lo que quise yo, lejos, siempre tengo que escaparme, ya no dar lo que quiero, que soy el bosque fantasma, que no puede entrar en puerto, cuando buscando refugio, en retratos y en espejos, en cartas apolilladas. Perfumados recuerdos. Say